In 1838, a party of 12 men, consisting of 11 convict settlers and one free man, named John Fleming, arrived at a hut on Henry Dangar's Myall Creek Station in northwest New South Wales, Australia, near Inverell. They were there to capture any Aboriginal people they could find, in revenge for the theft of cattle. The men gathered 28 Aboriginal people who were at a camp nearby and tied them up. They brutally beat the group to death. The group beaten to death included women and children. Later, they collected the bodies and burned them. When the manager of the station returned several days later, he discovered the bodies and decided to report the incident to the authorities. A group of police investigated the incident and found the burnt bodies. The 11 convicts were captured and charged with murder, but John Fleming escaped. Remember that John Fleming was the only free man among the 12 accused British settlers. The rest 11 were convict settlers, and by the caste system of the time, free British settlers were higher on the rung of Australian society. And as you can guess, the convict settlers were more readily disposable than John Fleming, a free British settler. He was never captured and may have been responsible for further mass killings throughout the Liverpool Plains and New England regions. There were 2 trials of the convicts. At each trial, a station hand named George Anderson, who was living on the property, was the only British witness to the incident. In the first trial, the men were found not guilty of murdering 2 Aboriginal men, but in the second trial, they were charged with the murder of one of the Aboriginal children. 7 of the men were found guilty and were sentenced to execution by hanging. The men were executed on the morning of 18th of December 1838. This was the first time that the European legal system had been used to punish British people for crimes against Aboriginal people. There was much anger among the British settlers that the 7 men were hanged for killing the Aboriginal people, who many regarded as black animals. Although the trial and hangings were intended to stop the mass unalivings on the frontier, it may have encouraged the settlers to further retaliate and to cover up the evidence. Indeed, the frontier battles and mass unalivings continued to occur for many more years, causing countless deaths in the Aboriginal populations. And in case you are among those who thought that the worst of inhumanity was done to Africans and black slaves, you may have to think again. Walk with us in this video to the end, as we show you another levels of inhumane treatments meted to Indigenous, natives, and natural landowners of the Australian continent, in the hands of mostly convict British settlers with the connivance of the free settlers. Kindly like, share, and subscribe to stay with us for more revealing videos. Let us dive in. A group of about 40 Aboriginal people set up camp on Henry Dangar's Myall Creek Station. A posse of European stockmen and squatters arrived one day seeking revenge for cattle losses. The Aboriginal people at the property had no involvement in these attacks on stock. Despite this knowledge, the men cold-bloodedly killed 28 old men, women, and children, and later another 3. Children were decapitated and many others hacked to death. A young woman was forced to witness her people being killed and was then repeatedly brutalized. Governor Gipps ordered an investigation into the mass killing with a view to prosecution. There was a great deal of public anger towards the government over this decision. In the initial trial, the 11 men were found not guilty. In the retrial, 7 men were charged with murder and sentenced to be hung. This horrific incident, which was later known as the infamous Myall Creek mass killing of 1838, was one of its dozens. It, however, became a landmark event for being the first time in Australian history that white men were tried for crimes against Aborigines, with some convicted. Sadly, other recorded instances of such before and after did not receive similar repercussions. Over a period of more than 50 years, since the arrival of the British fleet with free settlers and their convicts from 1788, they decimated the Aboriginals in numbers through several conquests and mass unalivings. Another example was the convincing ground mass killing that occurred in Portland Bay in the 1830s as a result of a possible dispute about a beached whale between whalers and the Kilcara Gunditj clan of the Gunditj Mara people, otherwise known as the Invasion of Victoria. The first permanent settlement in Victoria was in Portland on Gunditj Mara country by the Henty family, who were originally farmers from Van Diemen's Land, today known as Tasmania. In 1835, Major Thomas Mitchell led an expedition to the region from Sydney, arriving at Portland in August 1836. When he arrived, he found a small but prosperous Gunditj Mara community living off the fertile land. Colonists launched a war against local mob in order to invade their country. The Convincing Ground mass killing was one of such wars used by the colonialists to capture Victoria. It was a mass unaliving of the indigenous Gunditj Mara people by British settler whalers based at Portland Bay in southeastern Australia. It was part of the wider Yumarala Wars between the British colonists and Gunditj Mara. Tensions between the two groups had been building since the establishment of the town as a whaling station, some 5 years previously. However, around 1833 or 1834, a dispute over a beached whale had caused events to escalate. As Professor Lynette Russell from Australian Indigenous Studies at Monash University puts it,
"The Convincing Ground is probably the first recorded mass unaliving site for Victoria."
According to Edward Henty and Police Magistrate James Blair, in conversation with George Augustus Robinson, the protector of Aborigines in 1841, the whalers withdrew to the head station only to return with their firearms. Robinson's journal entry says,
"And the whalers then let fly right and left upon the natives. He said the natives did not go away, but got behind trees and threw spears and stones. They, however, did not molest them much after that."
No mention was made in the conversation as to casualties. Later reports arising from a meeting in 1842 that Robinson had with Gunditj Mara, people stated that only 2 members survived the attack. Robinson was briefed by Aborigines on the attack only when 30 men and women from various clans of the Gunditj Mara people met with him on 23rd of March 1842 at Campbell's Station on the Mary River, and told him that all but 2 men of the Kilcara Gunditj clan were slain in the attack. Historian Richard Broom estimated that about 60 were killed at the Convincing Ground mass unaliving. Bruce Pascoe, in his book published in 2007 titled Convincing Ground, Learning to Fall in Love with Your Country, said,
"The Gunditj Mara were beaten in that battle but never convinced of its legitimacy."
Further speaking, we would not be seen to have done justice to this topic, and especially this section, without the mention of the Black Line or the Black War, which was the longest-running battle to decimate and remove native Tasmanians from their ancestral lands. Relations between Tasmania's Aboriginal people and European colonists were hostile from the first recorded contact. By 1830, a virtual state of war existed. The British Lieutenant Governor responded by creating the Black Line, a military campaign involving a human chain designed to move all remaining Aboriginal Tasmanians to the Tasman Peninsula. Until about 12,000 years ago, low sea levels meant that Tasmania was joined to the Australian mainland by a land bridge. The original Tasmanians settled in the area by migrating from mainland Australia across this bridge at an estimated 40,000 years ago. When sea levels rose due to the vast melt that followed the end of the last ice age, the land bridge flooded to form Bass Strait. Tasmanians, on the island they called Trowunna, developed in isolation from other mainland Australian Aboriginal nations. The environment was resource-rich, providing excellent hunting grounds and fresh water sources for the Tasmanian Aborigines. Prior to European colonization, there were up to 15,000 Aboriginal people living in 9 nations. While Abel Tasman was the first European to map parts of Tasmania, naming it Van Diemen's Land in 1642, the first documented contact between Tasmanian Aborigines and Europeans occurred in 1772. French sailors, led by Marc-Joseph Marion Dufresne, came ashore on the east coast of the island and encountered members of a coastal tribe. This first contact quickly became hostile, and at least one Aboriginal Tasmanian was killed. Whaling and sealing were the first European industries in Australia after the British colonists and convicts began arriving from 1788. The movement of ships through the Southern Ocean led to further contact between Tasmanian Aborigines and Europeans, especially on small islands off the coast. These Europeans were responsible for introducing diseases into the Tasmanian community, as well as abducting women and children from coastal tribes to be used as wives and labor on ships. This devastated the Aboriginal population. The first permanent European settlement in Tasmania was at Risdon Cove in 1803. The British established the settlement not only to expand their Australian colony, but because they were concerned that the French, with whom they were at war, might try to claim the island. The British population in Tasmania consisted mainly of military personnel and convicts, and a small number of free settlers. The initial population numbered fewer than 3,000. However, by 1830, it had increased to about 23,500. Hence, the Aboriginal resistance. A rapidly growing British population in Tasmania and the ongoing destruction of Aboriginal tribes by disease, dispossession, and violence led to intense conflict between the two groups. Tasmanian Aborigines were vehemently opposed to British expansion and its impact on their home and communities. By the mid-1820s, the situation had become desperate for Aboriginal people, whose numbers had fallen to fewer than 2,000 by about 1818. Nearly 1 million sheep had been moved into prime grazing land that was also the native habitat of Aboriginal food sources like kangaroos and other native animals. The sheep destroyed local ecosystems and disrupted food and water sources. In about 1824, the Black War began, the most extensive conflict in Australian history. The Black War was extremely violent. Settlers drove Tasmanian Aborigines from their lands, murdering many. Most of the frontier conflict was concentrated on the traditional lands of four nations: the Oyster Bay, Big River, North Midlands, and Ben Lomond peoples. The land in this region was extremely productive and was quickly occupied by European settlers. Some of the most famous Aboriginal resistance leaders from these nations were Tongerlongter, Montpeliater, Manalarjena, Umara, and Warraturnatur Larjaner. Then Colonel George Arthur took up office as Lieutenant Governor of Tasmania in 1824, just as hostilities with Tasmanian Aborigines began to have a significant impact on the British population of the island. Initially, Arthur dealt with Tasmanian Aborigine resistance fighters by treating them as criminals and bringing them before the courts for punishment when they were caught. By 1826, this approach was proving fruitless, and Arthur declared all Aboriginal resistance fighters to be insurgents, meaning that soldiers and police could raid Aboriginal camps without provocation to arrest and detain any Tasmanian Aborigines they found. Many Tasmanian Aborigines were shot on sight, including women and children, leading to further escalations in retaliatory violence. In 1828, the fighting had become so vicious that Arthur declared martial law in the settled districts, labeling Tasmanian Aborigines as open enemies of the state and giving them no protection under the law. In 1830, Arthur issued his now famous proclamation, implying equality under the law for both black and white citizens in an attempt to calm the escalating situation. This equality was, however, non-existent, with white people seldom properly punished for the same crimes for which Tasmanian Aborigines were hanged. By 1830, all attempts to quell the violence were failing. Arthur was openly criticized by settlers who felt he wasn't doing enough to protect them and their assets, and the issue was often discussed with passion in the colony's press. In September 1830, under pressure from the Advisory Aborigines Committee, made up of private citizens who threatened to take matters even further into their own hands, Arthur called for a levée en masse, also known as a large conscripted force of able-bodied men. The levée, soon called the Black Line, was designed to force the Oyster Bay, Big River, North Midlands, and Ben Lomond nations from their lands. Colonists would form a line stretching across the settled districts and move south, pushing the local Tasmanian Aborigines onto the Tasman Peninsula, where they could be rounded up. From there, they would be relocated to Tasmania's offshore islands, putting an end to their resistance. The authorities had estimated that the number of Tasmanian Aborigines in these settled districts might be in the low thousands, based on the damage to European settlements they had done. The reality was that most of the population had died or moved to other districts, and it is likely that fewer than 300 remained. On 7th of October 1830, more than 2,200 settlers, military, police, and convicts, reported to 7 prearranged locations across the settled districts. The largest force ever mobilized against Aboriginal people anywhere in Australia. The line represented about 10% of the European Tasmanian population. The costs associated with this operation were huge, amounting to more than £30,000, about half of the revenue collected in the colony that year. Over a number of weeks, 3 separate lines of men moved slowly across the Tasmanian landscape. While there were sightings of Tasmanian Aborigines, the line did not have much success in forcing them to the south, with most slipping back into their traditional lands. Only 2 Tasmanian Aborigines were documented as captured, and the same number recorded as killed during the operation. While the Black Line was considered a logistical failure, in the long term, it did have the effect desired by government authorities and settlers. The scale of the operation, along with ongoing violence and disruption from Europeans, troubled the Tasmanian Aborigines, and they began to avoid living in the settled districts. Most were eventually persuaded to surrender to the authorities. The small population of about 200 Tasmanian Aborigines who remained in the settled districts after the line were gradually removed to Wibalena, a settlement on Flinders Island in Bass Strait. Confined to poor accommodation, exiled from their homes, suffering emotional trauma, plagued by disease and severely malnourished, most of those at the settlement died within a few years. By 1847, only 40 people still survived at Wibalena. Considered the last remaining Tasmanian Aborigines, this small group was relocated to the Tasmanian mainland at Oyster Cove. By 1876, all but one of them had passed away. Despite the savage reduction in their numbers and widespread attempts by settlers to remove all Tasmanian Aborigines from the colony of Tasmania, the Tasmanian Aborigine in the state today is thriving. According to the 2016 census, 23,580 people in Tasmania identified as Aboriginal and/or Torres Strait Islander. Culture and traditions passed down by the Aboriginal survivors of early European violence are alive and well. Traditional skills such as basket and necklace making and mutton birding are prominent in the community, who also participate in ceremony and learning and sharing language with younger generations. What many of the younger generations seem to wonder, especially on social media forums, has been if only anyone or any of their ancestral sorcerers and fortune tellers had warned their foreparents not to welcome the British explorers to the point of the historical arrival of the First Fleet. After all, other European explorers had been to the continent before the British James Cook. More so, natives, otherwise called mobs, of various parts of the now Australia, have been having transoceanic trade for centuries. Aboriginal people have lived on this land since time immemorial. In the Western sense, Aboriginal people have been here for between 80 to 120,000 years, compared to the colony which has been here roughly 230 years. Before Europeans had thought of colonizing other people's lands, Aboriginal people had established positive relations with people from overseas. Top-end mob had strong trade relations with the Macassan people from the island of Sulawesi in modern-day Indonesia. Between 1700 and until around 1907, fishermen sailed each year from Makassar to the Arnhem Land coast to trade sea cucumbers with Aboriginal people. Sadly, nobody can turn back the hands of time. Remember that in one of our videos we informed you that the first set of British settlers in the Americas were convicts. As you can see so far, the same was the case in Australia. The arrival of Lieutenant James Cook and then Arthur Phillip in 1788 marked the beginning of white settlement. From 1788, Australia was treated by the British as a colony of settlement, not of conquest. Aboriginal land was taken over by British colonists on the premise that the land belonged to no one, terra nullius. The history of Aboriginal dispossession is central to understanding contemporary Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal relations. Colonial takeover was premised on the assumption that European culture was superior to all others, and that Europeans could define the world in their terms. A colony could be established by persuading the indigenous inhabitants to submit themselves to its overlordship. by purchasing from those inhabitants the right to settle in part or parts of it, by unilateral possession on the basis of first discovery and effective occupation. Possession of Australia was declared on the basis of unilateral possession. The land was defined as terra nullius, or wasteland, because Cook and Banks considered there were few natives along the coast. They apparently deduced that there would be fewer or none inland. Their observations were soon proven incorrect. The governors of the first settlements soon found that Aboriginal people lived inland and had special territories and associations with land on a spiritual and inheritance basis. Nonetheless, they did not amend the terms of British sovereignty. In the first 100 years, there was no consensus about the basis of British sovereignty. Deaths in custody Australia's colonization resulted in a drastic decline in the Aboriginal population. Estimates of how many Indigenous people lived in Australia at the time of European settlement vary from 300,000 to 1 million. Estimates of the number of Indigenous people who died in frontier conflict also vary widely. While the exact number of Indigenous deaths is unknown, many Indigenous men, women, and children died of introduced diseases to which they had no resistance, such as smallpox, influenza, and measles. Many also were casualties to random killings, punitive expeditions, and organized mass killings. The Indigenous Australians, whose history has been established to be similar to Africans in more ways than color of skin, occupied the continent for more than 65,000 years before the arrival of English colonial settlers in 1788. They were hunters and food gatherers and survived on wild foods. While men hunted or fished, women collected vegetable foods, insects, shellfish, honey, and other small creatures. They did not have permanent settlements and moved depending on the availability of water and food resources. They did not keep domestic animals except the dog. Men used weapons such as the stone axe, hunting spears, throwing sticks or clubs, shields, and boomerangs, and they were expert at tracking and stalking game and knowledgeable about its habits, and even in open country. Indigenous women used a digging stick for digging up food resources such as grubs, roots, edible ants, and burrowing animals. Men usually traveled over higher grounds to see and hunt animals, and women walked on lowlands to collect vegetable foods. The Indigenous Australians were oral communities and kept their cultural heritage alive by passing their knowledge, arts, rituals, and performances from one generation to another, speaking and teaching languages, protecting cultural materials, sacred and significant sites and objects. Customary laws that passed from generation to generation through values and oral discourse governed them. As N.B. Tyndale, 1974, noted, Indigenous Australians controlled their communities by the use of song and the powers of ridicule and rebuke in them, although in some songs the added power of the man practicing death magic was also seen as a controlling force. In this regard, old dances and songs, describing the fate of ancients who misbehaved and suffered for their actions, were made topical, pieces being put in to make them fit the new circumstances. The British captain James Cook appreciated their egalitarian social system during his first visit to Australia in 1770. Little did they know that his return would be the beginning of misfortunes to their peaceful lifestyle. Indigenous Australians were not warlike people, and they did not engage in war to capture territory or to dominate others. There was small-scale fighting for reasons connected with magical killing, revenge expeditions, with disputes about women, and with trespassing on hunting grounds or sacred places. Indigenous communities made decisions based on the simple family, extended families, clans, and kinship systems. Kinship influences marriage decisions and governs much of everyday behavior. Kinship is about meeting the obligations of one's clan and forms part of Aboriginal law, sometimes known as the dreaming. But their easy, peaceful, and quiet lifestyle changed with the arrival of the British settlers in 1788. The European mariners started to explore the waters of the Australian continent in the 17th century. Between 1606 and 1770, about 54 European ships arrived on the coast of Australia and made contact with the inhabitants of the continent. These European explorers called the Australian continent Terra Australis Incognita, meaning unknown southern land. In the 17th century, many of the merchant ships that visited the continent belonged to the Dutch East Indies Company. In 1606, Willem Janszoon, a Dutchman, with a ship called the Duifken, and his crew explored the Australian coast and met indigenous people. In November 1642, Abel Tasman reached the west coast of Tasmania with two ships known as Heemskerk and Zeehan, and named it Van Diemen's Land. Following the Dutch mariners, Lieutenant James Cook, an English mariner, in 1770, explored the Australian east coast in his ship H.M. Bark Endeavour. King George III of England had instructed Cook on August 20, 1770, to claim the possession of the east coast of Australia that was later named New South Wales. French expeditions led by d'Entrecasteaux, Baudin, and Fourneau visited a few areas of Australia between 1790 and the 1830s. As the Dutch mariners did in the 17th century, the continent of Australia was totally colonized by England. The first British colonial fleet, led by Captain Arthur Phillip, reached Botany Bay between 18 and 20 January 1788. This fleet consisted of 11 ships and around 1,350 crew and convicts. These English colonists found that Botany Bay was unsuitable for settlement, and hence they moved north to Port Jackson on January 26, 1788, and camped at cove called Cadi by the Cadigal people. They traded food with indigenous people. Richard Broome in 2002 asserted that the English colonized Australia beginning January 26, 1788, when ships containing 290 seamen, soldiers, and officials, and 717 convicts sailed into Port Jackson to confront the Gamaragal people of the Sydney area. Taking an average from available records on the size of the arriving fleet, imagine unloading about 1,000 convicts of serious crimes from different cultures, with superiority complex unto a group of simple people with egalitarian lifestyle, as the British explorer Thomas Cook himself called them. That was the beginning of problems for the Gamaragal people, who were quick to notice. As such, the Gamaragal people avoided to deal with these settlers for 2 years, because of the following 3 reasons. The first reason was that they did not like how the British ordered convicts around and flogged or hanged them. The second reason was that they did not like the British unearthing of graves to steal the bones of indigenous people. While the third reason was that the Gamaragal people objected to the Europeans clearing the ground around a waterhole, possibly sacred, and casting nets in the area without permission. The second fleet arrived in 1790 with needed food and other supplies, and obviously more convicts. George Vancouver started the process of British colonialism in Western Australia in 1791 by claiming the Albany region in the name of King George III. Tasmania was occupied in 1803 and 1825, Western Australia in 1827, South Australia between 1836 and 42, Victoria in 1851, and Northern Territory in 1825. England sent to Australia over 162,000 convicts in 806 ships between 1788 and 1850 to colonize the continent. Matthew Flinders suggested the name Australia, and later it was adopted as the name of the country. Australia emerged in 1901 as a federation of the 6 English colonies. Ever since the last century, and until now, Australian native Aboriginals, though decimated and in minority in their ancestral land, have not allowed the segregation and subjugation from the British settlers to keep them down. Generations to generations have been at the forefront of demanding recognition, right to their land and living. These they have been doing through protests, strikes, petitions, and similar tools. Among the notable liberation activities are the 1938 Day of Mourning protests held in Sydney, 1939 Kumaragunja residents' protest against cruel treatment, 1946 Pilbara Strike, 1963 Yirrkala Bark petitions, 1965 Students' Freedom Ride through NSW towns, which was led by Uncle Charlie Perkins and his fellow students at the University of Sydney, 1966 to 1975. Gurindji Strike for Their Land, the 1967 referendum, extremely difficult but not impossible referendum to change the Constitution, 1972. The Aboriginal Tent Embassy was set up by Aboriginal activists on the lawns opposite Parliament House as a form of protest. Also, the 1982 protest at the Commonwealth Games can't be forgotten in a hurry. In 1982, the Commonwealth Games were held in Brisbane. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people used the international focus on the event to their benefit, bringing to light the injustices they faced every day by staging a protest. And arguably the most remarkable protest, especially in the 20th century, the 1988 bicentenary protest, just to mention a few. On the 26th of January 1988, many Australians celebrated the bicentenary of the arrival of the 11 ships of the First Fleet in Botany Bay and Sydney Cove on Bidjigal and Gadigal country. At the same time as the bicentenary celebrations, more than 40,000 Aboriginal people and non-Indigenous supporters staged what was at the time the largest march ever held in Sydney. There were busloads of Aboriginal people from other states and rural and remote communities who arrived to join the protest. The protest march was both a confirmation of the mob's survival and a reminder of the lies and misconceptions on which the celebration was based and supported. While the bicentenary celebrations focused on the discovery of Australia with a reenactment of the arrival of the First Fleet, the protest was a reminder that Australia had been inhabited at least 65,000 years before European invasion. In closing, it will be worthy of mention that all these struggles, strikes, protests, and agitations have not been without some positive results, such as the signing of various treaties, recognition of and apology to the stolen generations, participation in international tournaments and winning medals for the continent, return of land, artifacts and historical sites to descendants of and Indigenous peoples, constitutional amendments, and more. But more still needs to be done for the Australian Black Aboriginals and Indigenous peoples to be placed in their rightful positions. This brings us to the end of yet another video segment. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay tuned in. We've got a whole lot yet coming your way. Don't miss out. See you in the next video.